distinguished and honorable members of Parliament, other distinguished guests. Let me begin by saying that I'm really delighted to be invited by the Professionals Association to participate in this National Vision Seminar. You know, I have many friends in Sri Lanka, have had the opportunity to visit 3 or 4 occasions, and I keep an eye on what's happening next door, because I think that both our countries can learn a lot from each other. And when I received this invitation, I said, well, what is it that you would like me to talk about? And what they said was, why don't you talk about lessons from India, India's reform, which might be relevant for Sri Lanka today. Now, you know, that's always nice to look back, and it feels good to have someone say, well, look, you have some lessons to offer, but I do want to introduce a word of caution. And the caution is that, you know, each country is different. So usually in the old days, the IMF and the World Bank were often criticized for a kind of cookie-cutter approach, a sort of one-size-fits-all. And that, of course, is wrong. But at the same time, there are lessons. So one can look at the lessons from India and then have a somewhat separate decision. How much of this is really relevant and applicable for Sri Lanka? And in the latter, I mean, I'm obviously not the best qualified to pronounce, but you're a group of professionals, so I'm proposing to put these things, if you like, in a somewhat provocative way, hoping that you will think about it and try to absorb and somehow reflect that in what you think should be the right policies to follow. Now, first, 4 important cautions about why mechanical comparisons between India's reforms, which began in 1991, and what Sri Lanka is now going to do may not be, well, they're always relevant, but you need approach them with caution. First, you know, the attitude, intellectual attitude to globalization, liberalization, and opening up in 1991 was very different from what it is today. In 1991, it was a no-brainer. I mean, we in India were the outside guys. I mean, we were not doing what other people were doing. Communism had collapsed in 1989-90. The Soviet Union pretty much self-destructed in December of 1991. And within India, the left has intellectually always been important, but the fact that the influence of communism in Europe and, for that matter, in the Soviet Union declined sharply made it a lot easier to make the case that, look, opening the economy and globalization is the way to go. By contrast, right now, the global atmosphere is totally different in the sense that the very countries that laid the basis for an open global economy appear to be walking a bit backwards and introducing all kinds of restrictions as a result of the polarization that is taking place in the world. And that is a big difference. My own view is that while it is regrettable that the world is getting polarized, I still think it makes sense for countries in our region to remain open. The opportunities to integrate with the world in Asia are going to be the best of any part of the rest of the world. So in that sense, Sri Lanka is located in a part of the world that is not likely to be too much fractured. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is the state of the global economy. You know, when India liberalized in 1991, it was a period when the global economy was growing and global trade was also growing quite rapidly. Right now, in parallel with the intellectual change that's taking place, there's a slowing down in the global economy and certainly a slowing down in world trade. So that is also a difference. But then, as I said earlier, Sri Lanka needs to look at what are the trends going to be in South Asia and East Asia. I think those trends are not going to be towards extreme polarization and fractionalization. There will be some movement on the part of global supply chains away from China, but and there may even be a bit of a shrinkage of global trade. But on the whole, I think given the size of Sri Lanka, the logic of remaining open and benefit from it is very strong. And certainly I think that's true of India also. In fact, we argue in India that while global trade policy is sort of trying to shift global value chains away from China, that's an opportunity for India if we can sort of step in as an alternative. Now, quite frankly, if we succeed in doing that, then that success is the benefit to Sri Lanka also. Because India, in order to succeed, India will have to remain open. In fact, my view is we're not as open as we should be, and we should open up further. So that means you have next to you a fairly large country, a fairly large market. I mean, Mr. Krishna Kumar gave some very compelling comparisons that with such a large country, if we do well in India, and we're certainly trying to, and remain open, which we have to, although there are voices every now and then saying, look here, if the rest of the world is closing, why don't we do the same thing? That's wrong, and I hope that we won't follow that route. For Sri Lanka, the environment remains favorable to embrace openness. Two other differences which I think are relevant. You know, one is India ran into a serious current account crisis, but it didn't have an external debt crisis. So from our point of view, if you could fix the current account, the outstanding foreign debt was very small. That's not the case for Sri Lanka, and therefore the debt restructuring exercise that you have negotiated becomes very important. Now, the repayments due on that foreign debt are only going to begin a couple of years from now. So some of the tests of whether the adjustment you're trying succeeds, you'll have to wait and see. But it's something to keep at the back of one's mind. It only means, however, that you need to position yourself such that when those repayments begin, there's confidence that Sri Lankan economy is on the move and that its exports are also improving. And that will essentially make it relatively easier either to restructure a little bit more or refinance the debt or something. I think it's very important when looking at this in an open economy to appreciate the role of confidence. You know, during the East Asian crisis in 1997, there was one thing often said which struck me as very crucial. And what was said was, you know, confidence grows at the rate a coconut tree grows, and it falls at the rate a coconut falls. So it is very, very important as one goes through an economic restructuring to make sure that confidence is maintained. Because a decline or a disappearance of confidence can be a very sudden thing. And that's why it becomes very important to put across a sustained message so that people feel that, yes, the government and the country are behind the restructuring which they're talking about. And I think the vision outlined by the Honorable Sajid Premadasa, to my mind, is completely correct. Currently, the growth rates that are being envisaged are really very modest. I would hope that it should be possible to do better than that. Because unless you do better than that, it's unlikely that you will generate enough employment to satisfy the needs of the large number of young people that are getting added to the labor force. And you know, if India is growing at 7%, let's say, it's not impossible to think that Sri Lanka would be doing better than 3%. I mean, historically, you've grown at roughly similar rates to India, and there's no reason why you shouldn't. But for that, one thing is crucial, that in the reform program, the economy is opened up. This is actually a controversial issue. I mean, it's easy to say, but you know, when you get used to import substitution policies, you will find that people will say that opening up hurts certain people, certain groups, certain industries. You know, the fact is that if we are restructuring the economy to move from a low growth to high growth, it's not going to be a restructuring that will have no adverse effect. That kind of thing is not possible. It's not possible to go into a society and say to the larger group that, look, you've been growing at 2.5% or 3%. We're now putting in place policies where the country will grow at 6 and 7%. And what it means is every single activity that is currently being done will grow faster. Actually, what it means is we need to restructure the activities. New activities will grow rapidly and older activities will shrink. Now, you know, this is ultimately requires political genius, and this is where neither businessmen nor economists can actually help. Very often, people know what needs to be done. But you know, President of the European Commission, former President of the European Commission, Claude von Juncker, he became famous several years ago when he said, "We all know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to get re-elected if we do it." And you know, we find this in India all the time. I mean, we are full of, there are very few people in India who actually disagree with what's wrong. The problem is fixing it requires not just technical knowledge, it requires an act of political genius. Somebody has to be persuading people that, look, it's going to be all right, we look after you, we look after the poor. That is very crucial. In 1991, Dr. Montek Singh, when he announced the economic reforms, he made it very plain that the reforms are not going to be done without regard for the impact on the poor. And we will have elements of our policy which will ensure that benefits go to the poor, and those should be well identified. And I think they have to be fitted in to an overall strategy. But you know, not every business that grew up under import substitution is going to flourish if you transit to an open economy. What's going to happen is that other businesses will come up which will do even better, and those who are displaced from one part of the economy will get absorbed in the other part of the economy. And I think that is really what has to drive the broader notion of change. And I mean, you have a tough job to do on the fiscal side. I've looked at the numbers, and you know, Sri Lanka's tax ratios are quite low, and most of the projections that the institutions have made call for a significant rise in the tax ratio. You know, this needs to be put across publicly, and perhaps people need to be aware that this is an end result that you want. In other words, you can't sort of say, we want to have an increase in the tax ratio, but we're going to do nothing about the tax system. You can argue exactly what to do. You can argue that you don't necessarily need to raise rates, you need to widen coverage, whatever. But the debate has to acknowledge that the tax ratio has to go up. Quite honestly, if the tax ratio doesn't go up, it's not likely that you can achieve the rest of what you want to do. Because if you want to protect the poor, expenditures directed towards the poor cannot go down. So therefore, this has to be a very big part of it. The other I would say is that, I believe, I was told that the cabinet has cleared a national tariff policy. Now that would basically reduce customs duties over time. Sri Lanka has very high customs duties because of its following an import substitution policy, and those have to go down. I think we need to recognize that elsewhere, this is what we did in India, we were able in the initial period to reduce customs duties because we also managed a flexible exchange rate. So in other words, if the duties go down and the exchange rate depreciates a little, then it compensates the import substituting industry. Because while they get lower duties, they get a higher exchange rate, and that helps them. And of course, the exporters get a big benefit. When reforms were going on in India, I'd very often hear our politicians, I don't know whether Sri Lankan politicians have the same view, but our politicians very often criticize the government. Look at what's happened to the exchange rate. The rupee has weakened. We want the rupee to be strong as a rock, like the Himalayas. This was one quotation. And on the technical side, we try to persuade the political leadership that, it's correct to say that a strong economy is reflected in a strong exchange rate. I mean, if the economy is strong, they have better export performance, and most likely the exchange rate will appreciate. But if the economy is weak and you simply hold the exchange rate strong, you're only making the economy weaker. It is not correct to say that a strong exchange rate leads to a strong economy. It is correct to say the other way around. So the name of the game should be, let's work to making the economy strong, and if we succeed in due course, the currency will also become stronger. But while the economy is weak, it makes a lot of sense to keep the currency weak. And this is what developed countries also did. In the 1980s, the Americans put a lot of pressure on the Japanese because they felt that the Japanese were exporting everything to America, and they wanted the Japanese to appreciate their currency because the dollar being a reserve currency, they said the only way we can achieve a depreciation of the dollar is you appreciate your currency. Similarly, when the Chinese did so well in world trade, the American view was that they're doing well because they're keeping the exchange rate artificially low, and lots of pressure that you shouldn't do that. So I think in a transition from a relatively closed economy to a relatively open economy, lowering of customs duties is desirable, bringing in foreign direct investment is desirable, and it ought to be combined with flexibility on the exchange rate because these things work together. So with those words, let me just make one last point, and that is not everything you envisage will happen. I don't have the time. I see it flashing red already. Many things we thought we would do, and we weren't able to do them in time. And one or two of them we haven't been able to do even now. But if you have a credible set of steps, I don't think the world expects that you do everything. But the world will expect that, look, these were credible steps, and they've certainly done quite a bit in some of them. That's what leads to confidence. So I think it's very important that you have a well-defined set of policy objectives that is well discussed in the public, amongst the professionals, so that it's understood, and also that delivery, if not 100%, is at least very substantial. That was what we learned. I think we did quite well at the moment, and we hope we should do even better. and maybe we will, but we'll find out. But certainly I think Sri Lanka is well positioned at this point to make that transition in spite of many of the negative things you may hear about the global economy and global attitudes. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come.